First Sunday of Advent is often connected to hope, hope in what will come, hope in what God will do, hope for the future. But maybe you're like me and you hear the passage Deborah just read, which is a common Advent passage, and maybe it doesn't seem to have what you would consider to be a very hopeful tone. Distress in the nations, perplexity over the roaring of the sea, people fainting, the heavens shaking. It sounds more fearful than hopeful. In my ears, at least. To the people of the early church, though, these words brought with them a sense of hope. Why would that be? Well, this passage comes in a greater context where Jesus is talking about the ruin of the Temple of Jerusalem, which is a most sacred place, which the Romans destroyed about 35 years after Jesus died. So the people, as the church was starting to form, this really horrible, cataclysmic event took place for those people. And they looked back to Jesus' words, and they brought them a sense that even when it seemed like everything was shaking and crumbling around them, and maybe literally some of it was, that through all of that, God was with them, that Christ was coming to them, that God was still for them. And their role was to stay awake for it, was to stay alert to it, to stay alert and to look for the ways that God was coming to them, to look for God, to look for signs of God's presence. So to highlight their role of staying awake and looking for those signs of God's presence, Jesus gives them this image of a fig tree in this passage. And that's an image that I want to spend some attention on. I want to draw some attention to this morning. Jesus says when the fig tree sprouts leaves, you can see for yourself and know that summer is near. It's an image that says, though there may be distress and fear, look for signs that I'm closer than is apparent. Look for signs of growth and signs of life. Look for signs that I am coming to you, just as you are. Look for signs that God is at work. Not just at work out there, but also close to home and within you. Look for the signs. That's our Advent invitation from Jesus, to look for signs of God's presence, to have hope in what God is doing and what God will do, to stay awake to the future that is in God's hands, to believe that God's got you in ways you can't totally see, but that you can believe and lean into. In honor of Jesus' fig tree, I brought in a special plant today, not a fig tree, which I don't have, but a Christmas cactus. Actually, I learned that this one is not technically a Christmas cactus at all, but it is a Thanksgiving cactus. I know some of you have impressive Christmas cactuses. This is my impressive Thanksgiving cactus. It is a similar plant to a Christmas cactus. And when you come up for communion, you can take a closer look at it. But its leaves are a bit spikier than the Christmas cactus leaves. And it blooms earlier in the season. So it blooms each November. I bought it at Stop and Shop a few years back. And faithfully, without me doing anything for it, come Thanksgiving time, it looks like this. It's easy. Now, I do actually also have a Christmas cactus in my home. One that was given to me by my aunt. It had belonged to her great aunt, who gave cuttings to my grandmother, and my grandmother kept it on her porch, where it would sit and bloom each year on Christmas Eve during our family gatherings. After my grandmother died, my aunt took cuttings from her plants and gave it to all of the grandchildren. But for a long time, mine did not bloom. It was frustrating. All those years of it blooming right around Christmas time, and then it didn't. So I did some research on it. And what I learned is that a Christmas cactus needs two things to send out flowers. Does anyone know what those two things are? Darkness and cold. You guys are great. You probably have much nicer Christmas cactuses than I do. My house was too warm and too bright for this Christmas cactus to bloom. It needs lower temps, it needs a longer period of darkness than its cousin here, the Thanksgiving cactus, that blooms without me doing anything to try. When I think of Jesus' words about the fig tree, and when I think about a Christmas cactus needing dark and cold to blossom, it makes me think differently about this passage in Luke 21 and what value it might have for us with all of its jolting images and tone. It's easy to get a plant at the store that blooms without any effort, without any discomfort. But when you have a plant that means more to you and it won't bloom so easily, it seems like an invitation to be aware of the place that longer, colder nights have in the spiritual journey. It seems like an image that reflects what Advent hope requires. For a Christmas cactus, dark and cold are part of what make new growth possible, part of what allow it. Dark and cold are part of what spur beauty to come forth. Dark and cold are part of what prepares it to blossom with joy and with brightness and with color. To use the words of the passage, maybe perplexity and roaring waves and a feeling of being shaken are not things that stand entirely outside of our spiritual journey, but they have a place within them too. They open us to the necessity of hope. They open us to stay awake for that hope and to prepare for it, to prepare for the joy and the brightness and the color that we know will come. And so Jesus says to us, when you see these things taking place, you know that the kingdom of God is near. And Jesus says, stay awake. Because hope blooms out of the long night. Beauty blooms out of cold places. The future blooms out of reality as it is, not as we think it should be. And so our job, our task of faith within all of that, our spiritual task, is one of looking for those signs of hope and naming them when we see them. When the fig tree sprouts leaves, you can see for yourselves and know that summer is near. And so we look for those signs and we name them when we see them. And we know that the kingdom of God is near. Each time our junior youth fellowship group here, which is our third through fifth graders, each evening when they gather together, they have a ritual where they share the highs and the lows from their week, which I think a lot of is common among youth groups. But they have a particular way they do it. They call it roses, thorns, and buds. And so they share a rose, which is an especially good moment they give thanks for. A thorn is a challenging moment. And a bud is something that you're looking forward to, something that's not a rose yet, but that you trust will be. We've started doing this at my house in the evenings, and I've noticed how naming a bud, naming something that I'm looking forward to, creates joy now, even as it also looks to the future. Because looking toward what is to come is part of finding hope for the moment. Trusting the flowers that will soon be in bloom gives endurance and perspective when the night is long and cold. So as Advent begins, may you stay awake. May you stay awake to hope, like Jesus says in this passage, with your head raised and your back straightened, not in fear, but alert, looking forward to those buds that are forming, to those signs of God's presence with you and for you. Awake to those signs of God's presence that God is coming, and indeed is already here.